On this episode of Skeptiko, Alex continues his conversation with noted abduction researcher and Temple University history professor, Dr. David Jacobs.
Are you skeptical of all spiritual experiences?
People react to this phenomenon in a variety of ways.
No, take this phenomena out of it.
It's hard to, you've asked me a personal question that has nothing to do with the abduction phenomenon.
Why do you think that?
Because all I know is when I started doing abduction research, I really didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know what I was going to hear. And if this turned out to be a spiritually enlightening phenomenon, that would have been fine. That's okay with me. That's great, wonderful. I'd like to be spiritually enlightened. That would be terrific. But I just never hear this. It's just not part of this phenomenon.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode, part 2 of my interview with alien abduction researcher Dr. David Jacobs. Now, if you haven't listened to part 1 of this interview, you might want to go back to the previous episode of Skeptiko and give a listen, especially to the introduction, which kind of frames up the whole discussion of alien abduction and why we should even take it seriously in the first place, and why we might want to look at it from this extended consciousness perspective, which then leads us into this divide between those who think that alien abductions are some kind of spiritually transformative experience or are akin to some kind of shamanic initiation, and those like Dr. Jacobs who see this as a criminal act, an abduction in every sense of the word. So if you have those kind of questions in terms of how all this stuff fits in, suggest you go back to the previous episode. If you've just stumbled into this interview and you don't mind jumping in the middle of things, then go head on. Here's the second part of my interview with Dr. David Jacobs. There has to be some objective way of figuring this stuff out. We can't just take it on face value that, gee, your way is the right way.
This is a difficult question to answer because there isn't a number of people who've come forward with the actual techniques that they used. I'm writing a book on methodology and of abduction hypnosis. This is the middle book that's already basically finished. And you'll understand exactly how I work and what I do and the problem of confabulation, the problem of the first session that you use with a person, the problem of the second session, the problem with the third session, problems with the fourth session. They're all different, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just take the word trauma, which everybody focuses on. If this is a phenomenon that began in infancy and continued with frequency all the way through to when the person is 40 years old and they come to me, and they've had an abduction, let's just say the night before, and let's just say a week before that, and a week before that, or whatever, however many it is, the question then is, how traumatic is this phenomenon that has been part and parcel of their lives since they were children? And what I found is that, yes, it is traumatic, but the trauma oftentimes comes not just in it happening, otherwise these people would be wrecks. It comes in remembering what happened. That trauma tends to leave relatively quickly after the second or third session. And there are psychological ways of putting into effect, how can I put it, barriers to that. Now, let's put it this way, helpful suggestions to avoid that. And consequently, the word trauma has become a watchword for the abduction phenomenon as a whole. In fact, when people come to me for 10 sessions, 20 sessions, 30 sessions, over the period of months, I've been fortunate enough to work with people for years and years and years and years. They understand what's going on. They get it. They know. They know how long it's been going on. We've done stuff from when they were children and they were adolescents, and now they're 60 years old, and it's, they become like scientist observers in a sense. They're reporting back. They know what is happening. Now they are trying to figure out exactly the reasons. They're trying to figure out, they're trying to be more precise in what they're thinking. I do things on a logical and chronological kind of level so that I'm not injecting anything into them. And in fact, I've done experiments with them. I've told them, I say to them, what you just told me about this event sounds like a dream. This really sounds like a dream. I don't think this happened. I think this is a dream. And then I'll say, just before I do hypnosis, I'll say, this is a dream. It's a direct command. When I do the induction, which is a simple relaxation induction, and I start asking questions, they couldn't care less about what I just informed them of, that this is a dream. That doesn't mean anything to them at all. All they know is what happened to them. And I start chronologically. I also know that areas of confabulation are all over the place. And there's two number one areas of confabulation. Number one, description of aliens. I don't ask people what they look like anymore. Not until later. Not that I'm interested, I am interested. I will ask certain key questions that don't have to have them confront the face of an alien, but I know that they've confronted the faces of aliens all their lives. But when they tell me, for example, I remember he was wearing a mask or a hood over his face so I wouldn't see him, and because he didn't want me to be frightened when I saw him. I've heard that a whole bunch of times. It doesn't make any sense to me. They've seen these beings hundreds of times, perhaps. You mean to say the one thing they remembered is when they had a hood? So I work around that, and eventually I'll ask about the hood, and then they realize, the person isn't wearing a hood, and yet they thought he was wearing a hood all these years. And things like this. This regular hypnotist cannot do. They're not trained in this area. This is a different area of questioning. You have to be thoroughly knowledgeable in the abduction phenomenon to do this. And you have to understand the role of confabulation. The other main area of confabulation is recounting alien dialogue. The aliens told me blah, 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 blah. Well, yes and no. 9 times out of 10, the following event happens. All communication is telepathic on board a UFO. And this is everybody's used to this. Everybody knows this. This is what happens. That in itself is astonishing, because if this were psychological, people would not be saying that. They'd be saying some of it's telepathic, some of it they hear through their ears, whatever, it would be all over the map. But if all communication is telepathic and you ask them, well, what do you mean by telepathic? And they say, well, I hear thoughts that I convert to words so I can understand it. Or sometimes they say I hear syntax, I hear actual words and all that. The question then is, what's to prevent them from hearing their own thoughts and then telling me that the aliens told that to them? The answer is nothing prevents that at all. They do it all the time. It's up to me to understand this is confabulation. This is confabulation. A lot of people who do this kind of work don't get that. They don't understand that. They have not been, there's no training period for this. There's no standardization. There's no standardization methodology, I should say. What I do is logical and chronological. That's all.
And I think it's fantastic that you're writing a book on this and that you're going to be publicly open about your methodology, because I'm sure a lot of people want to see that. I think you'd have to realize that, anyone looking in at this from the outside would say, hey, that's great, but why does this guy think his methodology is so airtight? Or why is his methodology, which hasn't been subjected to that kind of scrutiny that we're just talking about, the only way to go? And let me, if I can, just reintroduce this part about the spiritually transformative experience, because I appreciate where you're coming from and that's not your thing. Fine. I'm not so willing to accept that Janet Colley or Mary Rodwell in Australia, who's a nurse and does alien abduction work with people and just kind of stumbled into it because people came in. And hey, there's a lot of people out there that experience life trauma around these issues and are seeking help. And it's great that you're out there, and it's great that as many people as possible are out there, because let's for a minute step back and say what has been the usual situation, that somebody walks in and seeks help or counseling, a therapist on this, and begins to tell them that they think they've had this experience, encounter with another, and they're said, hey, you're crazy. That doesn't happen. Take these drugs and go away. So let's put this in context and say at first we at least need therapists, counselors who are open to hearing these people's experiences. And now we're really kind of hashing out the details and the methodology and what we get out of that. But what I wanted to bring back on the table is, when I look at near-death experience science, like I was talking about, I really have to separate it. And I have to separate it and say, okay, what's the hard science published work that we have that suggests that consciousness survives death? And you just have to look at that separate. And you say, okay, that's pretty substantial. Then you look at the actual experiences that people have as they report these near-death experience encounters. Man, let me tell you, David, they are all over the map. They're crazy. They're Jesus, Buddha, morphing into this, leopard, all this crazy stuff. The problem with just kind of blowing past all that is these are hyper-lucid, most important experiences these people had at a time when they didn't have a brain. So I wonder, as I take that kind of sensibility and I look at the alien abduction phenomena, there's something that is appealing, I have to say, and also just kind of rings true about some of the spiritual aspects to that. And there's also a certain bias, I guess, I have when I hear you talk. Some of that I really buy into. I like the hard methodology. Just give me the facts. Try and ferret out. Try and, I don't want to say deceive people, but try and, trick people into not tricking themselves kind of thing. But I also say, wow, is that somehow shaping the experience into something that we is more digestible for us and easier for us to understand, when in fact we can't really get all the way there and trying to bring it down to our reality. Any thoughts?
Well, let me answer that in this way. When I was young and dumb, and I started doing this research and I started accepting everything that people told me, I fell into traps. I believed what was not true. And I learned it was not true later on, and from the same person. And I had believed it to be true. And once I realized that people say things that are not true in the abduction phenomenon. I'm not talking about near-death experiences. And as you know, near-death experiences have their own problems in that they are near death, and you don't know when the person had the experience after death or just near death.
See, that's just not true. But that's okay because you don't know about it. The reason.
Well, I don't know about it. I certainly don't know whether that's the case. And but the fact is, though, that
because let me just interject to get it in the broadcast. The reason that I say that's not true is in the same way that alien abduction and it's the famous white swan thing. It doesn't matter if you have some kind of wild, really medically unsound explanation for 95% of near-death experiences. You have enough that are clearly there's no brain activity, and yet there's a hyper-lucid, hyper-real experience. And all you need is one to prove that this idea that consciousness is purely biological and ends at physical death has been falsified. So that's where I was coming. But please continue.
Okay. But the fact is, though, that let me get back to my mainstream of thought. It's not that I was tricked. People said things that were not true to me, and I believed it. And when I realized that this had not actually happened, as the person later on in doing the same event again told me, I realized that I was an idiot. I was accepting things as fact that were not fact. I had to put in a set of controls into my methodology to try to ensure, to prevent this as much as possible. I'm not interested in hearing the inner workings of a person's mind. I'm interested in finding out what is going on in the abduction phenomenon. And I am obviously interested in hearing the inner workings of a person's mind as long as it relates to it. But the problem here is that their minds are altered. They're not thinking properly. And their reactions on board the object are themselves blunted. There's not a normal sense of the world, so to speak, that's going on. I've told this example many times, and I'll tell it again because it's so stark. A woman, this is a nighttime abduction. The majority of abduction cases about abduction events, which is, I don't know, I guess it's 1,150 or 1,200 that I've done, take place during when a person's not asleep or during the day and that sort of stuff. So I don't want to bring in sleep paralysis into this argument. But the point is that she woke up one night and there was Abraham Lincoln standing at the end of her bed. And he was Abraham Lincoln. He had a beard and he had a stovepipe hat and all the rest of that stuff. And she gets out of bed, and Abraham Lincoln takes her up to this UFO, and then they go into the room, take her clothes off, and Abraham Lincoln starts to walk with her down a hallway. I said, well, your escort, Lincoln, when you're walking down this hallway, where is he? Is he in front of you? Is he on the side of you? Is he behind you? Now, that might sound like a leading question, because I didn't say, is he on top of you or on the bottom of you? But that's a nonsensical question. So he's got to be somewhere. So she said, oh, he's in front of me. I said, well, when you look at him, are you looking down at him? Are you looking straight across at him? Are you looking up at him? Oh, I'm sort of looking down a little bit. Okay. Or maybe she said straight across, whatever. I said, can you see his stovepipe hat? And then she looked and she said, no, I don't see his stovepipe hat. That's a perfectly logical question to ask, because that's what she told me. I said, well, can you see his hair, the back of his head, his hair? She said, no, I don't see any hair in the back of his head. And then she said, I don't think this is Lincoln. That's confabulation, and that's logic put together. I'm just asking her to describe Lincoln. That's what it boils down to.
Right.
And she is volunteering, it's not Lincoln. She thought it was, but it wasn't. That's confabulation. That simple little thing, you'd be amazed how many hypnotists out there can't do. It's amazing to me.
Yeah. What's coming back to me from some of the extended consciousness work is, again, you bifurcate it and you say, first, establish the phenomena, establish that, Rick Strassman established that DMT really not only creates these hallucinogenic experiences, but put people into another realm where they're interacting with freestanding beings. Hey, or David Nutt, I think it's Dr. David Nutt in England, recently published experiments with psilocybin, contrary to what everyone was expecting, that if you do an fMRI on somebody's brain while they're tripping on psilocybin, hey, they're having these hallucinogenic experiences. Their brain must just be firing all over the place. Just the opposite shows up. There's a suppression of firing. Again, fits into this overall idea that consciousness is somehow outside of the brain and interacting with the brain. Once you get there, though, in the same way that you're talking about, kind of presupposing or imposing somebody's will on it, you understand that consciousness then becomes this very funny, strange thing outside of the human brain, and we might not be able to pin it down in every sense, although we have to try because it's the best consensus reality technique we have, but we might not be able to pin it down to this hard and fast reality. So that's what I keep pushing up against when you're telling me this. I don't know whether it's real or not. I guess one of the questions I have is, put on your researcher hat, your academic hat. How would we maybe devise some simple experiments to test this? Let's say we had a willing abductee who's willing to publicly subject themselves. Maybe they keep their identity and they do it in shadow or whatever, but they're publicly willing to subject themselves to hypnotic regression using your techniques, either by you or by someone that you kind of tell how to do it, versus comparing it publicly with somebody else's techniques. Would that move us any closer to understanding what's going on? And would you be willing to kind of somehow or other, I don't even know, I'm just making this up, somehow or another participate in helping that happen if I was to set it up?
Well, I don't know. It's harder to set up than you would imagine. First of all, if you set up somebody who's heavily into New Age, the New Age world, for example, and who's going to be asking, seizing upon any kind of modicum of what they consider to be spirituality in the phenomenon, and a person who does it correctly, that is to say, just asked logically and chronologically, then you're going to get two different types of accounts. But the question is, what is an accurate account and what's not an accurate account?
Yeah, doesn't that all come out in the wash? I mean, if someone is
no, it doesn't.
Well, but if it's public, and someone hears and says, and someone can say, oh, wow, there you're trying to interpret that as somebody saw Jesus and they should have asked this and this and this. I mean, in that sense, it comes out in the wash because the whole thing is video recorded and or transcribed, and someone can say, that's the mistake. Here's what you should have asked.
Well, I suppose something like that might be helpful. I'd have to think about doing something like that. The thing is that when you do this kind of research, I'll tell two things if I can remember the two things. Number one, a person who was heavily into the New Age, and number two, the controls. Let me do number one first. I once had a person who was extremely New Agey, and she traveled on the astral plane, and she'd done this and she'd done that, she talked a New Age sort of lingo that was very difficult for me to even understand, I must say. But she was abducted a couple of times, and I mean that she remembered. And we did 2 sessions, and one time, both sessions happened in New York City, I guess it was, and she remembered this, that, and it was all pretty standard stuff. And we just went from A to B to C to D, and all the way through to the end. And then she wrote me a letter and saying she was never going to come and see me again because she didn't remember what she wanted to remember and how spiritually uplifting this was and consciousness raising and all the rest of that stuff. And she and that's not what she remembered. And it was my fault because I was leading her chronologically through her event and asking those logical questions based on what she was telling me. And I treasure that letter because it shows how this phenomenon can become embedded in a person's consciousness, or unconsciousness, I should say, and they've built a core sort of a way of understanding it that comforts them and allows them to cope with it. And what I had done was I had not tapped into that coping mechanism and reinforced it for her. And so she never came again. But it showed me that I was on the right track, that I was doing something right. Now here's the controls. My world has devolved into listening to abductees talk about their abduction experiences over and over and over again. And I've heard many, many, many people, and they all say the same thing. And it's in certain detail, and I start at the beginning. Where were they when this happened? And how did they get inside this object? And whether they were alone or not when they did it. And what's the first thing they see when they get inside? And is it bright or is it dark or is it dim? And what is the size of the area that they're in? And are they wearing their clothes or are they not? And if they're not, they skip the portion where they took their clothes off. So we'll see if we can go back there. And what happens next? And then they go down a hallway and then they go into a room or whatever it is. And then what happens? And then there's tables and then, you know. And I can only talk about what they say and then ask more questions later on. So every once in a while, somebody will tell me something I never heard before. Now, that's rare in this day and age. It's rare. I have to say it is rare. But when they tell me something I've never heard before, that's not evidence. That goes on the back burner. I'm going to wait to see if anybody else ever tells me something like that or close to it that I've never heard before. If nobody ever does, it's not evidence. It still stays there. If other people begin to say the same thing and are not aware of this testimony, it becomes, in my world, evidence. This becomes now suddenly something important. The more people who say it, the better. Then I know I'm on the right track. At the same time, I will ask purposely misleading questions to see if these people will be led. This is especially true for the first and second sessions, to see whether they'll take the bite. I will say I will do, well, I'm not going to go into all the tricks of the trade, but I will do other procedures that try to lead them off the track, try to get them to obey what I am saying as opposed to what they're actually saying. And 99.9999% of the time they say the word that I'm looking for. No, wasn't like that. Bud Hopkins used to ask a question. You know, every time there's an abduction, people see a yellow alien who stands on the side of the room watching. He would say, you can see this yellow alien, can't you?
I think I heard you mention a parquet floor as something.
That was another one that I used to ask, right? And I had one person who said yes to that. That was the only time I ever heard that. But the answer for him is no. There's no yellow alien. What? Huh? In other words, you have to do that. And good therapists, good hypnotherapists, and good hypnotists, good researchers will do that just to try to make sure that the anecdotal evidence they're getting, and this is anecdotal evidence for just like all the other types of evidence, that the anecdotal evidence they're getting is as solid as it can be. It's still the basis of our criminal judicial system to a large extent.
So, one thing that strikes me, Dr. Jacobs, is for all this kind of hashing around we've done, the protocol is not that complicated. So when we talk about...
No, it's not. It's common sense.
Okay, because one person I spoke with before I spoke with you is Mary Rodwell, who's actually published some very public regression therapy work that she's done with abductees and all that. And then, as I mentioned, I also spoke with Janet Colley, although I don't know that she's published anything. Here's my thing. I like getting to the bottom of things, if possible, just for no other reason than no one else is doing it. There's this vacuum here. No one is approaching this. If it seems straightforward to me that if someone was to listen to this interview and basically understand the protocol and put down the protocol and say, okay, here's basically what I understand the protocol to be. We have to go through in chronological order. When there's gaps, we have to fill those gaps. We have to not steer away from meaning and steer towards concrete data. Then if they did such a session, got the person in advance, did the questionnaire so we know it's not someone who has, it's a person that we would normally kind of engage with and this kind of thing, I would think we'd be able to pretty quickly see if what you're saying bears out, or see if spontaneously they're talking about some kind of spiritual experience like some of these other researchers are talking about. Shouldn't that be pretty easy?
One would assume that if they followed the protocols that I follow, that they would not come up with anything spiritual. They would come up with something that has nothing to do with humans and has everything to do with aliens.
And one final question as we wrap this up. I keep getting the sense, are you skeptical of all spiritual experiences? Do you think there's any legitimacy to people who claim to have spiritual experiences, be they alien induced or not?
People react to this phenomenon in a variety of ways.
No, take this phenomena out of it.
Well, I don't really know. I mean, you can't take take the abduction phenomenon?
Yeah, take the abduction phenomena out of it. I get the sense, like, when I listen to, I don't know your opinion on it, but when I listen to Bud Hopkins in some of, who, again, tremendous, both you and he, I don't think we can adequately thank you enough for doing this work, hard work with, sure, you sold some books and maybe you stood up there on the podium, but I think you survived a lot more arrows, both in the front and the back, than anyone will ever appreciate. But back to my point, when I see Bud Hopkins, I say, there's a humanist. There's a guy who's kind of dedicated to kind of an atheistic kind of view of things. Now, I'm not a religious person, and I'm certainly not pushing any kind of religion or any kind of specific spiritual tradition. I just come at it from the data, and I say there's a reality to these unity consciousness experiences that people have had throughout time, reported throughout time, in every culture, and in every way we can measure it. There seems to be a reality to it. But I get the sense that Bud Hopkins and people from that humanist side just are really not, either haven't looked at the data with this kind of a willful ignorance kind of thing, or are just really closed into a worldview that doesn't really allow for that. And I guess I just have to ask where you're coming from on that.
Right. Well, I'm not coming from, it's hard to, you've asked me a personal question that has nothing to do with the abduction phenomenon.
Why do you think that?
Because all I know is when I started doing abduction research, I really didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know what I was going to hear. And if this turned out to be a spiritually enlightening phenomenon, that would have been fine. That's okay with me. That's great, wonderful. I'd like to be spiritually enlightened. That would be terrific. But I just never hear this. It's just not part of this phenomenon. I didn't have any dog in the fight, so as Clinton used to say when I first began this. I was a neophyte. I didn't know what to expect. And it wasn't just a few years before when I thought the abduction phenomenon was really basically a psychologically induced phenomenon. And so, you're asking me to answer a question that does not relate to my research. If people were having spiritual experiences from this, fine.
I have to push back. Now, I think it's relevant in the sense that we're talking about these two camps, and one camp says there's these spiritually transformative experiences. I think it's relevant to say, has the evidence that you've amassed through not only your abduction research, but your overall life experience convinced you in the reality of spiritual experiences? That seems to me to be extremely relevant because we all have our worldview. I just shared with you why I'm convinced of the reality of that, but then I am going to look at things in that way and can be expected to, but you can kind of push me away from my thing. Just show me the evidence that isn't true. So I don't know. Well, I think it's important because I think if we're talking about are these spiritually transformative experiences, if someone's coming out and say, well, I don't think there's any such thing as a spiritually transformative experience, I don't think those things happen, I think that's relevant.
It's not so much relevant for me. Other people have had spiritually transformative experiences, and that's I can agree with that. That's fine. In other words, you're not going to pin me down here because the way I look at it is through a social scientist's eyes. That is to say, I'm trying to find out exactly what happened, what's happening, and why. So far, people have not told me about spiritually transformative experiences, given the fact that they've been abducted since they were children over and over and over again.
Well, I think you make a strong point with that. And I also think, let me add that I also think you make a very strong point when you talk about the inherent deceptiveness of the phenomena. And I think we have to appreciate that because I'll tell you my position. I see a lot of disconnect between the idea that these are spiritually transformative experiences with the experiences that are, more in the realm of what we generally associate that with, somebody having a near-death experience or some kind of spiritual awakening that have been reported a long time. I don't see the parallels that a lot of other people see. And when one of the things that I focus on is this idea of deception. You really don't find that in the spiritual literature or the unity consciousness literature. There isn't someone who's deceiving you in that way that is clearly part of the alien abduction phenomena. Now, that might not be something that you're interested in, but I do want to make that point because I think that clearly comes out of this, is that there's this mind-altering aspect of it, but there's also this deceptive aspect of it that you talk about.
Yes, there is that. And we're talking about a few different things here in a way. We're talking about how people take the information away from their abduction events and what they do with it. And that has to do oftentimes with hypnosis and with the quality of hypnosis and with the lack of concern for confabulation. That will obviously affect people. If people find comfort in that, fine. I'm not about to disabuse people who by telling them, oh, you're wrong or anything like that. This is a personal phenomenon, and it happens to people, and it's intergenerational. It goes through the generations, and it's not like what other people have seen. And to me, it's not unusual for people to ascribe all sorts of different meanings to this who don't fully understand what exactly is happening. That's the only way I can describe it. Now, I know that there are people who have done even more hypnosis sessions with me, and they still find spiritually enlightening events and all the rest of that stuff with abductees. But they came from a different position than I did. They didn't come from a more objective position. They oftentimes came from the New Age world or have New Age proclivities, which is fine. If people want that, if they want to cope with the phenomenon by dealing with that, that's fine. My world is the world of finding out exactly what's happening and why. That's my world. If I were to find that this is happening because they're spiritually enlightening people, that's fine too. I have not found that, period.
Well, Dr. Jacobs, I appreciate this time. We spent over an hour and a half on the phone. Tell folks a little bit more about these upcoming books, when they can expect to see them, and as much detail as you care to share on what's going to be in them.
The first problem is getting a publisher. A prospectus that I had for this book that I'm writing now several years ago was rejected by my publisher, Simon & Schuster. So I've got a new prospectus that I'm just about to write as I finish this whole damn manuscript that I've been writing. Usually a person doesn't write a manuscript until it's
sold.
Until you until it's sold. But I figured that that this would be a better way for me to go right now, because then I'm in a position to publish it in different ways. I do have other publishers another publisher basically who's waiting in line for it. But we'll see. I hope within this next year it'll be published. The book on methodology, which is virtually done, I figure that the audience for it is in the tens and tens. So I'll probably have to self-publish that book. And the third book, which will be my truly crazy book, is still in the back of my brain, and so that's going to be a few years down the line.
Great. Well, we'll look for all that. In the meantime, folks can keep up to date on your work through your website. It escapes me right now. Can you give that to me?
www.ufoabduction.com. I haven't diddled with it in a long time. I haven't added anything to it. And so I've got to revamp it and redo it and put some more stuff on it. But there's still quite a lot of information on it, I must say.
Well, I appreciate you joining me. I know you're a busy guy. I do hope that you leave open the possibility of maybe collaborating in a way that doesn't take a lot of your time, but maybe some kind of review of some protocols. I'd love to try and put a little bit of time and a little bit of money towards doing some honest research, objective research, and see where we come up. But I just hope you'll stay open to that, and I'll try and stay in touch and see what we can come up with.
I've been there, done that myself.
All right.
This is what I call a negative cash flow business. The money just flows out of my bank account every time somebody walks into my home office.
I hear you. That's the name of the game. Been great talking to you. Thanks again.
Talk to you later, Alex.
Okay, David.
I'm here.
Everything good?
Everything sounds good.
Yeah, great stuff. I think we.
Sorry, you couldn't pin me down on all this stuff. It's just not in my world. I mean, my world is as I said, is just the facts, ma'am. And
well, no, I think you handled it. I think you handled it well. I think you handled it fine. Again, I come at it. Those are just the facts. I mean, consciousness survives death. Anyone who doesn't believe that just hasn't looked at the data. Now, what that means in terms of whether you believe in God and all that, you can have your own place, but consciousness surviving death is just, well, it's just a fact.
Let's put it this way. I hope you're right. I'm 71 years old now, and I sure hope you're right.
Well, it's out there, all the data. But hey, it's great. I think we can go with it as is, right? No problems with any of that?
No. I didn't say too many things that were ridiculous and stupid.
No,
just my normal amount.
No, on the contrary. I think it's great, and again, I appreciate it.
Okay, Alex, it's all yours.
Well, I want to again thank Dr. David Jacobs for spending the time joining me on Skeptiko and trying to wrestle some of these issues to the ground. As you heard there at the end, I'm really pushing towards some kind of further research to kind of explore that. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen, particularly since we've kind of uncovered some things about Dr. Jacobs since this interview that I think might make it hard to engage him further. And in particular, I'm referring to a response that we got from Will Bucci. Will, I hope I didn't totally butcher your name there, but Will is from the John E. Mack Institute, an organization that has tried to preserve and further extend the work of John E. Mack. Now, the reason that Will's comment is important is, let me go back and read for you again the quote from David Jacobs where he said this about John Mack. I think John Mack is just dead wrong in his analysis of this. In fact, he tried to ram the abduction phenomena into his preconceived ideas about consciousness and never could. That's a pretty bold statement. Most people don't realize that he gave up. That's a factual statement that I think is proven to be incorrect in what we've discovered. Again, Jacobs continues. He said, "That's it, I don't want to do it anymore," because he could never get it to conform to his ideas. 2 years before he died, he stopped doing abduction research altogether. Again, a factual statement that I think is incorrect. He closed his peer group at Harvard and told Bud Hopkins that maybe he'd been a little bit too gullible. He could never fit it into what he wanted to be. Now, we did some digging, and I want to read for you part of the reply from Will of the John Mack Institute. Here's part of what he said. To your inquiry, Jacobs' repeated claim that Dr. Mack gave up his interest in alien encounters is simply false. Lists some facts. First, he points out that even though Dr. Mack had wrapped up his alien abduction research a few years before his death, he continued to speak and write on the subject, as well as consult with experiencers who saw him up until his death in 2004. This fact is also confirmed by a Vanity Fair article that places Mack right in the center of one of the support groups just a month or two before his death. So I think that part's pretty well established. Then he goes on to explain why he wrapped up his research, and he gives several factors, including the fact that he thought he really had amassed enough at that point and published several books. And I think, like a lot of people, when you've been in a topic for a while, you can understand someone reaching a point and say, okay, that's it. I've done it. I don't really have more to say. Actually, a point that David Jacobs is pretty close to reaching himself. So I think that's totally understandable. A couple of the other reasons that he mentions are just more human reasons. The guy was 75 years old when he stopped actively doing sessions with alien abductees. And Will Bucci gives a couple of other reasons. You can read all those. They're published on the Skeptiko forum. We'll provide a link to that. But I thought I'd add this final summary statement. Simply said, Jacobs' claim that Mack gave up is false. And if I were to speak freely, I feel it's a claim that feeds into Jacob's narcissism, Jacob's opinion that he alone has the discernment to learn the truth about alien encounters. Now, I've asked Dr. Jacobs to respond to this. I have yet to hear from Dr. Jacobs. I don't know if I will hear from Dr. Jacobs. If I do, you'll hear about it. So moving on and wrapping up this interview with Dr. Jacobs, I would tee up one question from this second part of the interview, and that is a question that we've asked over and over again in different ways, but it's particularly poignant here, and it is, does worldview matter? If you're a social scientist, humanist, code speak for atheist, and you don't really believe that people have these experiences, extended conscious experiences, spiritual experiences, if you really believe deep down that that stuff doesn't really happen because that's how you've been trained and that's the party line that you have to toe, does that worldview affect your research, affect your science? Now, of course, we can never fully answer that question. We never know because you bring what you have to the situation and we can't really create a hypothetical you that might come to a situation with a different worldview. But my question for you is, do you think, based on everything we know at this point, that Dr. Jacobs' worldview has influenced his view about the possibility that some of these alien encounters have these spiritually transformative elements to them? Now, I'm reluctant to go to the next part of that question and ask, what does that mean? In particular, what does it mean in the context how those alien spiritual experiences compare to other spiritual experiences? Moreover, whether those experiences are genuine spiritual experiences or whether some of them are and some of them aren't. As we've said all along, this is a very thorny mess of an issue to pull apart. It's really complicated. Unlike some of the stuck-on stupid debates we get into, this is one that has meat and substance. The further we go in, the more mysteries we find. But then again, that's the way I like it. That's when I feel like I'm growing, learning, or having the opportunity to. So if you have some thoughts on that question, or I guess any of those questions I kind of mixed in there, please join me for a discussion on the Skeptiko forum or in the comment section of the new Skeptiko website. I should mention, I did publish the new website, so if you have any thoughts on that, or in particular, if you spot any problems with that, please drop me a note and let me know. Of course, the way to connect with me is through the Skeptiko website at skeptiko.com. As mentioned, you can jump on over to the forum, which is the best place to really get a response out of me if you're looking for that or some thoughts from me. But you can also leave a comment right there on the Skeptiko website. You can, of course, connect with me on Facebook or drop me an email, and I try and get back to those as soon as I can. So I have one more show that I want to do on this topic. I think you'll find it very interesting. I also have a couple of other shows on different topics in the hopper. I'm not exactly sure what order they're going to come out in, but we'll just kind of play that by ear. It is Thanksgiving here in the United States, and I need to get busy on cornbread and turkey, which is my job in the cooking order here. So I better wrap this up and get on with that. Thanks for joining me. Do take care, and bye for now.
Let's just say a week before that, and a week before that, or whatever, however many it is. The question then is, how traumatic is this phenomenon that has been part and parcel of their lives since they were children? And what I found is that, yes, It is traumatic. But the trauma oftentimes comes not just in it happening, otherwise these people would be wrecks. It comes in remembering what happened. That trauma tends to leave relatively quickly after the second or third session. And there are psychological ways of putting into effect, how can I put it, barriers to that. Now, let's put it this way, helpful suggestions to avoid that. And consequently, the word trauma has become a watchword for the abduction phenomenon as a whole. In fact,
explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode, part 2 of my interview with alien abduction researcher Dr. David Jacobs. Now, if you haven't listened to part 1 of this interview, you might want to go back to the previous episode of Skeptiko and give a listen, especially to the introduction, which kind of frames up the whole discussion of alien abduction and why we should even take it seriously in the first place, and why we might want to look at it from this extended consciousness perspective, which then leads us into this divide between those who think that alien abductions are some kind of spiritually transformative experience or are akin to some kind of shamanic initiation, and those like Dr. Jacobs who see this as a criminal act, an abduction in every sense of the word. So if you have those kind of questions in terms of how all this stuff fits in, suggest you go back to the previous episode. If you've just stumbled into this
On this episode of Skeptiko, Alex continues his conversation with noted abduction researcher and Temple University history professor, Dr. David Jacobs.
Are you skeptical of all spiritual experiences?
people react to this phenomenon in a variety of ways.
No, take this phenomena out of it.
It's hard to, you've asked me a personal question that has nothing to do with the abduction phenomenon.
Why do you think that?
Because all I know is when I started doing abduction research, I really didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know what I was going to hear. And if this turned out to be a spiritually enlightening phenomenon, that would have been fine. That's okay with me. That's great, wonderful. I'd like to be spiritually enlightened. That would be terrific. But I just never hear this. It's just not part of this phenomenon.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we interview and you don't mind jumping in the middle of things, then go head on. Here's the second part of my interview with Dr. David Jacobs. There has to be some objective way of figuring this stuff out. We can't just take it on face value that, gee, your way is the right way.
This is a difficult question to answer because there isn't a number of people who've come forward with the actual techniques that they used. I'm writing a book on methodology and abduction hypnosis. This is the middle book that's already basically finished. And you'll understand exactly how I work and what I do and the problem of confabulation, the problem of the first session that you use with a person, the problem of the second session, the problem with the third session, problems with the fourth session. They're all different, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just take the word trauma, which everybody focuses on. If this is a phenomenon that began in infancy and continued with frequency all the way through to when the person is 40 years old and they come to me, and they've had an abduction, let's just say the night before, and when people come to me for 10 sessions, 20 sessions, 30 sessions, over the period of months, I've been fortunate enough to work with people for years and years and years and years. They understand what's going on. They get it. They know. They know how long it's been going on. We've done stuff from when they were children and they were adolescents, and now they're 60 years old, and it's they become like scientist observers in a sense. They're reporting back. They know what is happening. Now they are trying to figure out exactly the reasons. They're trying to figure out, they're trying to be more precise in what they're thinking. I do things on a logical and chronological kind of level so that I'm not injecting anything into them. And in fact, I've done experiments with them. I've told them, I say to them, what you just told me about this event sounds like a dream. This really sounds like a dream. I don't think this happened. I think this is a dream. And then I'll say, just before I do hypnosis, I'll say, this is a dream.